tsunami, earthquakes. Okay, there we go. And currently I'm a postdoc here at the Media Lab working on more computational social science. And my research is still looking at disasters and pandemics and how human behavior responds to shocks, things like that. So needless to say, to this crowd, cities are facing diverse and compounded challenges like aging infrastructure, pandemic risks, climate change. And one thing I want to kind of add to that is all of this is happening while we're seeing really exciting shifts in technology, like autonomous vehicles, electric vehicles. I think you had Professor Joseph Chow on last week, but he works on EVs. I'm kind of trying to collaborate with him right now on understanding behavioral change due to the adoption of EVs, and all of these compounded shocks are really interesting because they affect not just the physical environment, but also they change how humans behave. This is a photo from Onagawa City right after the tsunami and 10 years after the tsunami. And you can see this massive reconstruction of these buildings, and you can see, a lot of people seem to be active in the city center. And this is kind of what we envision to be a really good disaster recovery. But then traditionally, civil engineers have looked at this picture and has focused on these physical systems recovery, which they call, or we call, engineered resilience. But we can think of many cases where, or in the disaster context, we can also have this other perspective of this recovery of socioeconomic systems. Just because we've recovered the physical systems does not necessarily mean that the communities or the social networks or the relationships between people have recovered as well. So that got me into computational social science, the need for civil engineers or engineers in general to focus more on creating these resilient socioeconomic networks. And you can find many examples of this, how human behavior and social networks amplify these shocks. So for example, when we want to have a good tsunami evacuation system, of course, we have to have these nice roads, these nice evacuation alerts that work, but also we need to have this mechanism where so people can pass on good information, right? We need to have a good system of social influence. Otherwise, people may think, oh, tsunami evacuation isn't necessary, and then they stay despite having good roads and despite having good alert systems. So social dynamics is essential. We saw many cases during the pandemic as well, where the infrastructure is great and everything, all the buildings are properly maintained, but because of human behavior change, like remote work, local businesses, especially near the central business districts, have suffered significantly. But on the other hand, we can find good cases where we can use this positively, right? So New York City has done a lot of these open streets activities where they open up the entire street for pedestrians, and that has resulted in boosting the local economy. So this is kind of a shock or something that amplifies the shock, but also could be used to improve various situations. So the main kind of research agenda that I have is to look at this interdependent dynamics between social systems and also physical built environments. And because, as I mentioned before, in these past examples, these are very interdependent with each other, meaning one shock in one system could cascade across different social systems as well. So our goal is to build these computational models, data-driven models of these complex interplay between collective social dynamics and the urban environment. And to touch upon some of the projects that we've been working on and some of the projects that I'll try to expand on when I start at NYU as well. I'm just listing them here. As I mentioned, I did a lot of work on post-disaster social physical recovery, so looking at the recovery of social systems as well as the physical environment and how they affect each other during disaster recovery. Another current work that we're trying to finish off right now at MIT is to look at the resilience of businesses to behavioral changes. So if you think about KAIST, and if you think about a cafe that's near KAIST, if all the students and faculty stop going to KAIST because of online education or pandemic closures, that cafe near KAIST is going to suffer. And that's kind of an obvious example, but behavior change and the effects of behavioral change could cascade across different industries, right? So that's the main thing that we want to model here, and we use that. We do that using mobile phone data. Another project that I've been working on is to look at the interactions between your online behavior and physical behavior. So we have a nice collaboration with Yahoo Japan, who has both location data as well as web search behavior. So what do people search? What do people comment on? And where they move and how they interact with people physically. So that's an interesting kind of line of research. And I'm also, with my civil engineering background, I'm also always interested in policy applications regarding EVs, public transit, and things like that with multilateral government agencies as well as private companies as well. So many things, but today I wanted to focus on one specific topic that hopefully is of interest to not just civil engineers, but also I heard from Yunjin that there's people from management science and people from non-engineering backgrounds in industry. This paper that was just published, not just published, it's already half a year now, but just published looking at the diversity of our encounters in cities and how that changed during the pandemic. So we know that a lot of the economic mobility, or how well you are able to go up the economic ladder during your life, is dependent on many things. Many things in the US, especially race, income, what kind of area that you grew up in are very important. But this study, which was published in Nature back in last year, actually, found a really strong association between economic mobility. So that's what's the probability that you'll make it to be wealthy when you become an adult, and the number of, or the percentage of rich friends that you have on Facebook. And this is kind of a proxy of the diversity of, or the wealth of the social connections that you have in real life. And this has shed light on the need to kind of look at, focus on who do people meet and interact with, rather than just looking at where people are born and where people are visiting. And in the management science literature, actually, I prepared this a minute ago. We know that diverse teams achieve greater success, and this has been studied in many contexts in business schools. And teams with diverse kind of expertise are able to solve more complex problems. So diversity seems to be a positive factor in many scenarios. In addition, we find that many of the friendship ties that we make are added from who you encounter in cities. So if you only meet a specific type of people, then your friendship network becomes very homogeneous or less diverse. Also, we found that during the disaster recovery, the social networks are really important, and they manifest as a thing called social capital, which is kind of representing how much are you willing to help each other during disaster recovery or during disaster events. And fortunately, we have a lot of individual behavior data that we can use for our research. The main thing that I'll be talking about today is the GPS location data. But again, we have a lot of social media data, online interaction, sentiments, credit card transaction data to look at what people are purchasing, what are the needs of the people, as well as web search data that tells us what people are kind of seeking in terms of not just material things, but also informational things as well. Okay, so this is a video of GPS location data. Typically contains around 5% of the population. And these individual pings are the actual visits to specific locations like cafes, restaurants, schools, things like that. And using this, we can detect the home location, workplace locations of each individual, and also specific visits. Here, I'm showing you the colors are actually the estimated income of each individual. So we can overlay the estimated home location with the survey data, American Community Survey, which is kind of a census data, to estimate what's the approximate income of each individual. So you can play it again. you can see areas like Boston University, where there's a lot of students. Red meaning lower income people are concentrated here. MIT is kind of in the middle, especially downtown Boston. You see a lot of different colors mixing. And so this is what we're kind of looking at. What's the diversity of the income of the people that you encounter in cities during the day? It's something that we want to analyze. And this is important because if you look at the data, it tells you that the average travel distance to any given place from your home location is around 9.5 kilometers. So, and this is kind of US statistics. Maybe it's different in different countries, but this tells you that people travel a lot during a typical day. And because of that, if you just look at where they live, that doesn't tell you the full story of what their world or what their social interactions are. As a result, 75% of the people that you meet or encounter live more than 15 kilometers away from you. So this is another example or evidence that tells you maybe you should start looking at where people go and where people meet rather than where people live, which is kind of the traditional way of looking at segregation. So the key question is where and why are we segregated in the sense that we're only having homogeneous interactions? Very simply, what we do is we estimate where people visit from GPS pings, like this person went to this restaurant. We aggregate all the people who went to this restaurant on the same day, and these shapes indicate the income bracket. So the square is the rich people, and then the pentagon are the poor people. And then what we do is we quantify the unevenness of the distribution. So if you have ideally, you would want to have 25% each from each income quintile to have the most diversity. On the other hand, if you only have people coming from one income distribution, so it's going to be like 0, 0, 0, 100%, then that means it's a very segregated or not diverse location. Our lab has been working a lot on this at MIT. There's actually an online portal called the Atlas of Inequality. So you can go on here, and then you can click each location and see what's the distribution of the income of all the people who visit these locations. So it's quite interesting. For example, these are two restaurants. One is called Chipotle Mexican Grill. It's a kind of a fast food Mexican place. Another is called Clover Food Lab, and this is a more kind of posh vegetarian menu fast food. These two places have, if you go there, you spend around $13, the same. So the price is kind of the same. But if you look at the people who go there, you see that Chipotle has a lot of low-income people, and I'm guessing this is mainly MIT students. But on the other hand, Clover Food Lab has a lot of high-income people. And I'm guessing this is more faculty and research senior members at MIT. So even though these places are only 25 meters apart, you see these very different mixing of people in two different restaurants, even though there's the same price range. And if you look at all of the type of places that we have in cities, you see really interesting patterns. So this is plotting on the x-axis how far a typical person moves to get to that location. So for example, gate or platform, these are airports. There's only one airport in Boston, so typically travel a long distance, like 20 to 30 kilometers. But because you travel a long distance and everyone goes there, there's a low segregation or high diversity of these locations. On the other hand, more places that attract small distance travels, you get to have these local clustering of people, so you have more segregation, more homogeneous mixing of people. And there's a negative correlation there, which I think makes sense. The actual place that had the highest diversity in Boston was the Science Museum, which is very pleasing for the city of Boston people. And this is mainly due to the city of Boston giving free tickets or free admission tickets to school, kids at school, and then them going with their parents from diverse income backgrounds to science museums. On the other hand, schools, like elementary schools, middle schools, high schools, they're very segregated. Typically, American schools have these district rules. So the people or the classmates you have at school tend to be very similar in terms of socioeconomic background. Good news for a Japanese guy. So ramen places have a really high diversity, meaning rich, poor, no matter what your income is, people go to the same ramen place. That was quite interesting to look at that. And the key question that we asked in this paper was, how has this changed during the pandemic? To give you the conclusion, our cities have become much less diverse during the pandemic, and this might be, intuitive if you look at your own life. In 2019 April, you see many blue points indicating more diversity at these locations. During the initial lockdown and the pandemic, that has reduced significantly. But even after that, 1.5 years after the pandemic, you see a slightly lighter tone of blue here. So that means the diversity of the encounters you have in cities are a bit less. And to give a number to that, we see that in many cities across the US, places are still 15% less diverse compared to pre-pandemic levels. By the beginning of 2022, which was kind of when we had no COVID restrictions, people were free to move around the city, even no mask mandates in some states. And you might ask, maybe this is because people are staying at home and people are just going around their neighborhood. That's kind of partly true, but not fully true. We see that if you look at the number of visits to different places a user has on average, that has recovered back to pre-pandemic levels by late 2021. Also, the amount of time that you spend at cafes, restaurants, things like that, that has also recovered back to normal. So the natural question is why do we see that 15% reduction in diversity? What we did was we set up counterfactual simulations of human mobility, and we simulated what would happen how much diversity would we lose if people, for example, simply reduced their activity, quantity of activity, right? So we know that during the pandemic, the number of visits to, for example, restaurants went down by 60%. If we randomly start removing visits from the 2019 data, how much diversity would we lose? That's kind of the simple scenario. A more complex scenario is introducing more heterogeneity in visits reduction. So we know that rich people were able to stay at home more compared to poor people because they could do remote work. We also know that parks didn't have a significant decrease in visits, but arts and museums did because they had to close. We also know that people started going to places near their neighborhood, as opposed to going out further distances. So what if we take all of those factors into consideration and start removing or simulating visits? How much diversity would that lose? And the remaining effects is more microscopic, individual effects in terms of place visitation patterns. And in a nutshell, what we found was around 55% of the decrease in the 15% diversity, so 7.5% or 8%, could be explained by the structural macroscopic changes that we had during the pandemic. But the remaining 45% of that was attributed to these microscopic individual changes in mobility. And maybe some of you are familiar with this model called the social exploration and preferential return model. It essentially boils human behavior down to visitation or exploration and exploitation, like the reinforcement learning kind of literature, where at a certain probability, people explore new places. 1 minus p, people return to places that they've already visited in the past. And we fitted these parameters, all these different parameters, to different periods of the pandemic. And surprisingly, we found that many of these parameters are consistent, even though behavior seems to be very different. The only parameter that significantly changed during the entire period of the pandemic was this social exploration part. And social exploration, what I mean here is this is the probability where once you decide that you're going to visit somewhere new, what's the probability that you will visit a place which is full of people different from you in terms of income? So, and that has significantly decreased, as you can see here. So more qualitatively, what this tells us is, compared to before the pandemic, we stopped exploring places that are less familiar to your lifestyle. And there's a lot of reasons that could be behind this change, but one of them could be fear of infections, and that became sticky even after 2 or 3 years after the pandemic. So we have less exploration, and also we are seeing much more routine behavior. So going to fast food, donuts, big box stores has increased. But on the other hand, we see less visits to gyms, hospitals, hardware stores, things like that. So in a nutshell, our lives has become less exploration and more routine, which is a bit more boring. And so that's the result that we found in the paper. Building on top of this, we're working with various policy makers or public agencies to try to make the situation better. So one project we have is the project with museums in Boston. How can we create more inviting public spaces? And what are the policies that these museums can implement to attract different people from different backgrounds? Also, the city of Boston right now is doing an interesting project where they are making a bus line that goes from the low-income neighborhoods to the high-income neighborhood free of charge. And they want to know how much does that increase ridership on that bus route, and how much opportunities does that open up for the low-income people. So we're working on that together with the city of Boston. Also, because there's much more remote work in the US, still, I think around 40% of the people are doing remote work twice or more during a typical week. So places like co-working spaces like WeWork has become much more important. How can we design these locations so that we can have more social mixing and mixing of not just income, but also mixing of skills, and to generate more innovation and more economic opportunities? So that's something that we're working on, trying to build on top of what we found in the paper. So yeah, that's, I think, 25 minutes, but we found that diversity decreased by 15%, even though the quantity of the mobility has recovered. We see that behavioral changes resulted in less diversity of our encounters. And as I said, we're working on many exciting applications in post-pandemic co-working spaces or infrastructure investment policies. And this is the paper QR code. So if you're interested, please check it out later. And these are my fantastic collaborators. And I think that's it. Yeah. Thank you so much. And as I said, I'll be moving to NYU from January, and I'm currently looking for PhD students and postdocs. So please let me know if you're interested. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Taka, so much for the talk. It's always, I mean, this is probably like third time that I'm, looking at this, but still very fascinating. Always learning something new. We have one question from Seiyun in the chat box that this might be a bit of a tough question, but besides economic diversity, do you expect personality diversity to show a similar result, although appropriate data may not be available at this time?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Actually, there's other researchers who have kind of done similar work in terms of not income diversity, but also political preferences or race as well. And they have seen some similar results in the sense that we see more homogeneous mixing. One thing that I'm currently studying at NYU is to look at the skill diversity as well. So estimating where people work, and then from that we can estimate their skill sets as well, because we know the industry code of that company, and then whether that kind of mixing in terms of skill sets or expertise has decreased as well. One thing that we're doing in another study is to look at online mixing, whether you talk more to people who are different from you in terms of preferences or hobbies, things like that. And there are initial results showing that that has also decreased. So there's a lot of correlation between many factors, including income, but not just income. So It's a great question.
Great. I have another question from
Yeah.
Chorung that I wonder, how did you get such a detailed mobile data, including GPS? Is there any cooperation
Yeah.
with the communication company?
Yeah. So that's a great question. So this is GPS data, not telecommunications company data. So as I said, the GPS percent sample rate is around 5%, which might not be very high, but still we can do a lot of things. So we work with a company called Spectus. Spectus, yeah, they used to be called Cubic. They changed names, but they collect GPS location data from smartphone apps. So we have a long-standing collaboration with them. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. Certainly. Third question is from Kwang-han, that when estimating unevenness, maybe in page 19, how is the distinction made between a situation with a lot of low income and the one with a lot of high income, even if they have the same unevenness?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, yeah, I can go back. Yeah, so that's a great question, actually. This metric doesn't only looks at the absolute difference from the 25% line for the 4 bars. So we just take it's a very simple metric. So we don't distinguish between 0001 and 1000. The reason for that was we wanted to focus on the mixing purely and not on whether there's a concentration of rich or concentration of poor. But there's a very significant difference in terms of what kind of places have high segregation or low diversity and a lot of poor people versus low diversity and a lot of high income people. So typically you see more high income people concentrated in places like colleges or parks and museums, whereas you see more low income people concentrated in fast food locations. So there's a lot of things that you can dig deeper here.
Thank you. We have 2 more questions. Let me go over real quick. So from May, which methods have you used to measure encounter diversity? What are the limitations of your current method?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question as well. I can give a 1-hour talk about the limitations because there's so much to do, and I hope if you have the chance to use this kind of data, I think there's so many interesting research questions. One limitation that I think we have right now is, as this slide shows, we're just taking people who go to the same location on the same day. So we don't know whether these 2 people are actually talking to each other or they're actually interacting with each other, right? So there's a big difference between encountering people. We call it brushing our shoulders in the US. That also there's also a lot of psychological and sociological results saying that if you see a specific person, that kind of feeds into your social norms or your behavior. But if we are able to see, more granular data about how people interact in cafes or how people interact in parks, the probability coefficient of those different types of places would be very different. Right? The probability of an encounter turning into an interaction. So I think that's a big limitation right now. And I have a PhD student at NYU who's interested in that. And if you're interested, I can connect you with her. So she's going to look at combine this with more observational data, survey data, camera data, to look at, are people actually interacting or are people just hanging out in the same area? So that's one limitation that I can think of.
That's a fantastic direction.
Yeah.
Another question from Eugene that thank you so much for the great presentation, same for me. Aside from the research, I really liked visualizing the mobility data. What tool did you use to display the GPS point data in real time?
That's a good question. So what we use is we use a lot of different packages. One I would recommend is called MobMap. It's a tool created by University of Tokyo people, and it's really good in visualizing dynamic animations. The one we used here was using R, so it was very simple, the video. But I think MobMap is really interesting. I think now a startup company is maintaining that, but yeah, I typically use Python. I'm a Python user, but I typically use Python to create these kind of plots. So I think it should be very simple. Yeah.
Okay. The last question is from Sujin. Thank you for sharing your work. Social exploration seems interesting. Do you have any plan to interpret this concept in terms of place attachment that individual has, or any other behavioral index such as revisit probability and stay time to infer the meaning of the place for each individual? Well,
Yeah,
that's a big question.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. You know, it kind of leads to the question of why do we explore? And one thing we've kind of been thinking, and one angle that we've been thinking about recently is different social demographic groups have different tendencies to explore. So if you think about your own life, maybe grad students, you guys explore a lot. And that's mainly because you're trying to seek opportunities. You have a lot of time and some money. But then if you look at different age groups or even gender groups, maybe in some cultures, the exploration rate is much lower. So that angle is something that we've been trying to look at, whether that decrease in exploration is mainly due to college students having to stay at home for online education, or whether it's office workers having to do remote work from home, things like that. So I think, and yeah, revisit probability and stay time, those are some indexes that we could look at as well. But surprisingly, the revisit probability didn't change. So if I go back to this model, the revisit probability here is proportional to the amount of time you already spent in that area. That didn't change. So I think that's kind of not the correct hypothesis, but yeah, the meaning of place for individual and each individual's kind of stage in their life or objective of the exploration could be something interesting to look at in the future.
Yeah, I have another question from Yuyo. Thank you for your great presentation. How did you divide the income ranges? Do the categories have the same proportion or the same range?
Yeah, thanks for the question. What we did was we divided the income ranges into four four groups with equal number of population. So in terms of Boston, I think it was in the video, it's around 0 to 40, 50K. Yeah, 60K, sorry. And then 60K to 80K. So these are not the same ranges, but they're actually the same number of people who are in each bin. And we did a lot of experiments. You can check it out, the supplementary material of this paper. It's around 60 pages long. We changed different, we did this with 4 income bins, but we did it for 5, 6, 7. The general conclusion didn't really change. So yeah, so I hope that answers your question. And thank you for all the questions. That's
yeah, I mean,
yeah, great. Yeah.
You're the person who got the maximum number of questions
Really?
from the
Okay.
audience,
I'm
largest
very
number
honored.
of questions. I also have a couple of questions and maybe an
Yeah,
idea
please
to
go ahead.
explore together.
Yeah.
The two questions in the slide 27 and 28, the diversity overall seems to continue to recover. Which we can kind of guess in to some degree. So I'm just wondering what's your opinion on the recovery pattern, in that it means whether it means the urban landscape and interaction go back to the 2019 level, or it's sort of evolving on its own to something new.
Yeah, I think that's a super interesting question. Unfortunately, we stopped the analysis here, so we don't know. But what we find in other research is that the built environment is changing as well. So, for example, around half of the office buildings in New York are empty. And there's a lot of push to recreate those office buildings into residential buildings. And if those kind of significant changes in the built environment occur before the experienced segregation or experienced diversity recovers, maybe there could be a locked-in effect there. So, if more people, and if you rechange a office building in Manhattan to a residential building, of course the rich people are going to go there. So that could kind of really change how people meet in cities, and there could be a significant, almost like a permanent change. So I think that's an interesting point where these short-term behavioral changes could also lead to these long-term changes in the built environment, and that could reinforce the behavior changes that we see in cities.
I see. Yeah, another question that I had is, the result that you got, the insight that you got from the study, do you think it can be generalized to other cities or other locations?
Other countries, you mean?
Other, I mean, you have the Boston and you have
yeah.
Right. So if
Yeah, so
can I take the result as something that I should see maybe in Seoul and Tokyo as well?
Seoul and Tokyo, I don't know. Because at least in Tokyo, the rate of remote work has significantly recovered. So people are going to offices now. Also, but on the other hand, Tokyo has a lot of still COVID restrictions, like putting masks on, things like that. So I wouldn't try to oversell and say, yeah, this is generalizable. I wouldn't say that.
Right.
But at least in the US, there's a lot of generalizable insights from this. And in another study, what we found is even though Dallas and New York and Boston, they're very different cities structurally and topologically, but many of the characteristics can be very, very similar. So
I see. And I have a couple of ideas that I want to kind of talk with you, but just for one, Namu and I have been interested in sort of the measuring or quantifying the quality of life at much finer scale in the urban environment. So by looking at your diversity measure, we might want to measure the quality of life in certain parcel or maybe blocks or district or the community level by measuring the level of mixture of this diversity, and then kind of wrap it up in a single index or something. So that's going to be one the idea that we can explore together.
That's a fascinating question. So one project that I have right now with collaborators in Japan, actually public health people, is combining this metric of social interactions and social diversity with mental and physical well-being of elderly people. So there's a huge survey. Yeah, there's a huge survey in Japan collected from 130,000 people every 4 years in Japan. And that asks very qualitative questions like, in your community, how many people can you trust? Or in your community, how many people can you ask for money if you need money? Or how many social groups are you going to? Or things like that. And those are really interesting questions, but I don't think anyone has really tried to connect the macroscopic social networks with these kind of results. So yeah, I'd love to talk more about what we can do together.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm interested in the elderly quality of living, and also the about the disabled or a little bit less fortunate or the maybe marginalized group in terms of mobility. So that could be one area that we can explore together, definitely.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic. Actually, I was talking to Professor J.R. Rizzo. And so he was talking about if we can get data about how disabled people, physically disabled people are moving around the city, maybe because of the limitations of the built environment, the places that they can go to are quite limited, could be limited. And because of that, there maybe the amount of economic opportunities or the diversity of the interactions that they could have in cities could be limited because of the built environment. So I thought that was a very interesting question.
I met him over Zoom, and we had such a fun conversation, and he was supposed to be here in December on his way to
Oh, okay.
Thailand, but his Thailand trip was canceled. So,
Oh,
but
okay.
I'll be in New York at Tendon in January. So I'll just
Oh, really? Okay.
we just said we'll catch up in January. Are you
Yeah.
going to be around?
Yeah, I'll be fully there in January.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. All right.
Okay, fantastic.
All right. Thank you so much, Taka,
No,
for
thank you so
the
much.
wonderful presentation. We learned a lot, and big applaud for you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Virtual.